Morning, Tony.
Hey Robert, morning.
Morning. For some reason, my background is there, but I'm not. Can you hear me now?
I
Can you
can,
hear
I can,
me?
I can hear you fine. Welcome. You okay, Robert?
Yeah, I think there's just a bit of a lag. They've been doing works, and I understand a lot of the country's been down with the internet, so it's lagging a bit.
Yeah, we'll do our best. We'll just try and persevere through it. But thank you
Yeah,
for coming on the podcast. I just want to
that's
kick
okay.
off by asking what the appeal is of the microscope.
I actually got one when I was about 7 years old for Christmas, and I was one of the few that persevere because lots of people get microscopes for Christmas, but the toy quality is usually so poor that I saved up my pocket money and I got a better microscope. And then I started seeing some of the things that, were the wonders of the world, the true wonders of the world, rather than a pyramid, a big block of stone. It's nice that people managed to build it, but these are the real wonders of the world.
Do you think it's that curiosity to see things close up that drives you to get better?
It is sometimes that you are the first person to see something. Even now, amateurs are discovering new species that no one has ever seen before. So, yes, there is that element of curiosity. There is also that wonder the first time you see anything. I run a club with my friends Gordon Brown and Steve Durr called the Anglian, and we did a session on crystals. And people were looking at the crystals, and I showed them particular set of crystals. Sort of, wow, oh my God. And these are people that are like me in their early 60s, late 70s, who were looking at these things for the first time in their life. So yeah, it is that wonder and that sense of curiosity about what's next.
I've seen some of the very small images of like sugar cubes, for example,
Yeah.
and they look amazing when you look at them in that closely.
The things you want to look at are under polarized light, and you get all of these wonderful colors coming out. You only need two strips of Polaroid. Um, uh, uh, how can I put it? At the lowest level, you can get two lenses out of Polaroid glasses and do it, but because they're curved, it's not necessarily the best. But you can get a sheet of Polaroid for a couple of pound and make your own Polaroid. And you don't even need a microscope to see the crystals. You can just hold the crystals up on a piece of glass, piece of Polaroid in front, piece of Polaroid behind, and you can see the structure of those crystals.
Have you got a particular subject that you like to look at?
Right, I am a generalist. That means that if if you have a look around, this is my little workshop. You can see that I have stereo microscopes, an inverted microscope where the light comes up from below. That's the images on these screens. You won't see it very well on this, but there are tiny little flagellates zooming around in the background and some bacteria. Then I've got some of the bigger microscopes there, metallurgical one. There's a big metallurgical one behind me. That entire thing there is one microscope. The biggest one I've got is a couple of meters tall, so I go right across. There are people who are very specialized. They don't just specialize in a particular type of crustacean. They'll only look at one species of that crustacean. So it's the same as with any hobby. There are people who are generalists like me,
Yeah.
and people who are very specifically into one thing. I'm curious about everything.
Would it be safe to say, is it an obsession? Your a
My wife
fascination?
would say so, yes.
And is it a hobby of yours looking at the
It's been
microscopes?
a hobby since I was 7 and took a big break from it when I was at work. And then when you retire, you make that decision about do you want to sit and vegetate in front of the television or do you want to actually do something and keep your mind active and also social? Because, like all of these things, if I'd have been interested in steam engines, I'd probably been at steam rallies. If I was interested in classic cars, I'd gone to classic car rallies. In microscopy, we've got lots of clubs and lots of social events where you go to meet like-minded people and learn from them.
What's been the most amazing thing you've seen under the microscope?
The most amazing thing that I saw was actually one thing that I saw, which was the first slides that I looked at, which was called the scale leaf hairs of a silverberry. And that was just because of the pure saturation of color. I like art as well as science. And art of microscopy is one of the things I enjoy. You or your listeners may have heard of someone called Robert Hooke. He wrote a book called Micrography, which was a very, very famous book, 1665, and he had a picture of a flea in it. That's my homage to his flea. I drew that one, and a little art box here. If I go down, you will see some of the other drawings that I've done. So I enjoy the artistic aspect of microscopy as well, but there's the photography. Photography is an interesting aspect as well.
Did you? So you drew
and a
those?
lot of photographers do get into microscopy. And astronomers, because in this country we often have wet weather, and microscopy is a hobby that you can do indoors. On here, have a look on there. That's live on one of the microscopes I've got at the moment. I'll just move it around to prove it. There's just a little spider, and that's on a stereo microscope. Obviously, it's a Victorian slide. The spider wasn't killed for the making of this podcast.
So you're happy to look at whatever takes your interest. That's your approach.
The thing that I look at a lot, pond life, simply because you're looking at something that's living, and you're not just looking at a still image, you're looking at how they behave. Now, it will be slightly different because they've got a bright light shining on them or through them, and their behavior won't be exactly as it is in a pond, but it gives you some idea of that micro world. It's the difference between on a microscope slide that's prepared, looking at a still photograph, and when you're looking down the microscope, that things that are alive, it is like being in one of these Hollywood movies. You can just sit there and get absorbed, and you sort of go into that zone where you're so interested in what's happening down the microscope. You tune out the television or the radio, and you're just absorbed by what you're doing.
Like you, I had a microscope for Christmas as a child. I think everybody goes through a phase of having a microscope as a present, and you give up. You do, because it's very frustrating. Is that because they're not very good as microscopes go, and really you need to get a better microscope?
You can get, if you go to a club, I belong to several. One's called the Microscopical Club. We do lots of public outreach, and there is a website, www.cricket.org, which will take you through buying the microscopes. If you can't, get to a cricket meeting, there are clubs in Leeds, Northampton, just outside Norwich, just outside Ipswich, down in the south, that will help you. There's one in Manchester as well, that will help you with microscopes. The Anglian and the Iceni, we help people by restoring old microscopes that were of research quality. They were used in hospital, they were used in research laboratories, and we do them up and let people have them at a very, very low cost.
You mentioned looking at pond life. If we were to take some, I don't know, some water out of a local pond, what sort of stuff would we see under a microscope?
You can see the larger things that you can see with the naked eye, like copepods. They're a crustacean. There's Daphnia. You will have known them as water fleas, maybe. Those are one thing that I do study more than most things. They're called Cladocera. You've heard of something called Daphnia that people feed to their fish if they've got tropical fish. You'll also see tiny little things called rotifers. They look a bit like a worm with wheels spinning on their head. They're not worms. You will find lots of nematodes. You will find a huge amount of stuff. Then going down the scale, you will find lots of protozoa. You'll find things with flagella. You'll find amoeba. One of the meetings that I went to at the Milton Group, run by Chris Thomas, one of the people there, Bill Morris, actually found a particular amoeba that is so large you can see it with your eye. And it's the first one he'd seen in about 10 years and the first one I'd seen in about 30 years. So you do find things that are quite rare.
Would you say it's hard to, can it be a challenge to get something magnified under a microscope without tuition or research? Are they quite easy to use?
They are incredibly easy, especially now you've got things like this. If I can hold one up. Here we go. These are digital inspection cameras. They're very ubiquitous on things like AliExpress and eBay. They're basically a little box with tricks in it and a camera. You just put that above what you want to look at and plug it into your computer, and you're away. So you don't need lots of very expensive equipment. Some of these now, the little boxes on the top, you can get for less than £20. They're not an expensive item now.
So it is a very accessible
Yeah.
hobby. There's lots of equipment, lots of ways into it.
Sorry, I missed it. It lagged.
I was saying it's a very accessible hobby. You don't have to spend a lot of money
It's very accessible. To look at the things that I look at, you've got half a jam jar of pond water that will last you for weeks. The cost is an empty jam jar. Microscopes that we have at meetings, we have from £10, which is less than an Nando's.
And like you say, there are a network of clubs up and down the country where you can meet like-minded people and share your knowledge.
I don't think anyone in England, I won't go as far as Scotland, but anyone in England is probably no more than an hour and a half drive from a microscopy meeting now. We've got a big group that meets in Leeds. But in addition to that, there are people who don't identify necessarily as microscopists, but use microscopes a lot because of their hobby. For example, beekeepers use it to identify the diseases of bees and also the types of pollen that their bees have been collecting. Because if you want to say that you have got a particular type of pollen, you've got to be able to show that you've got that pollen in the honey, and it does make up the majority of your honey.
So in terms of membership and people who are interested, would you say that it's men and women, all ages?
Yeah, the Anglian in particular, we've got a large number of women across the hobby. In the older age groups, it's dominated by men, like a lot of hobbies were, simply because of the demographic and the sorts of things that people went through at school. When I was at school, it was still the thing that males pursued one career path line and women pursued another path line in general. Now there's much more equality, and so people tend to have more equality in their hobbies as well. Not so many children, simply because you've got to have someone to drive you to a meeting, and it comes down to whether parents are willing to drive you to the meeting. We do have people who bring grandchildren along, but it's not the norm. The Northampton group has quite a few children go along to their meetings, their annual meeting, but the general meetings are more people who are retired. But microscopy is a hobby. If you go on to Facebook, there's groups like Cricket Micro, Amateur Microscopy, which have got a large number of members, and the profile there is about 50% male, 50% female, and the age range usually goes from people who are in their late teens up into their 80s or 90s. And it is a more, how can I put, equitable distribution of people.
And what's the smallest thing you've ever seen under the microscope?
Individual atoms when I've visited, because as well as the light microscopy, I do go to university facilities and look at the electron microscopes and atomic force microscopes that they've got. So individual atoms are the smallest thing that I've seen.
I can't even visualize what an atom would look like. I mean, could you describe it?
It's this thing of anything that you look at is not the actual thing. It's the light that's been processed by the machine, whether it's a light microscope or an electron microscope that you're seeing. And the images that you're seeing is what you're interpreting, because when I'm looking at you on the screen, I'm sure that you're not only that high.
And how does electron microscope, is that the word?
Yeah.
How does it work?
They shoot beams of electrons rather than light, and they're focused by magnetic lenses rather than glass lenses like we use on our microscopes. But you might not think there are many amateurs who do it, but there are amateurs who were involved in using them for work, who, when they've left work, have purchased electron microscopes. And there are amateur electron microscopists. And some of them, if you find the right Facebook group, will happily accept specimens. You send them off to them, they'll prepare them and send you images of your specimen. So if you've got something like a fly head and you want to see a bit of pollen on the eye of that fly, send them off and you'll get an image back.
It is incredible when you look at these images of really quite benign things like the inside of a cable, for example,
Yeah,
that powers your kettle or whatever. When you magnify it really closely, it becomes almost like a different thing. Something
yeah.
that's very routine and innocuous becomes incredible, really, to look
It
at.
is that thing of scale. Anything that you can look at, you can prepare. Microscopy has been going on for a long time, sort of 1525, the first real references to machines that we now call microscopes. But it wasn't until 1625 that they were called microscopes. Before that, they were called all sorts of things. In a couple of years' time, we're celebrating the year of the microscope, because it'll be 400 years since the term has been coined. And each year we have World Microscope Day on the 13th of April. And we have Zoom meetings at museums that are open to the public, just so that people from outside can come into the hobby.
And did you say you draw some of the things that you see?
Yeah, I draw because it's a nice, relaxing
Yeah.
hobby. And when I first started microscopy, I know it sounds like, back in the day, we walked up the hill to school in 6 foot of snow. But back in the day, you used to have to use film, and you either took transparencies or film and then developed it and then printed it. And maybe you'd have 35, 36 exposures to look at. I used 2¼ square film, which meant that I had 12 exposures, and I had to think very carefully about what I did. Now I've got cameras where, if I want, I've got a stacking machine built by my friend Gordon Brown, and I can take 20, 30 images, one after the other, stack them up at different focus levels and get really pin sharp images. I can stitch images together. So I can take a tiny little bit, take another photo, stitch all those images together. And all it costs me is the electricity, which I know is a bit more expensive, but you're only talking about a tiny little bit of electricity to do that. So people tend to take lots of images and don't concentrate on the specimen so much. Whereas when you've got to draw it, you have to look at it very carefully. I think it's like one of these tours where you do a whistle-stop tour of Europe. One day you're in Amsterdam, the next day you're in Berlin, the next day you're in Vienna, and you get a taste of what it's like with digital photography. But if you want to know the flavor of the place, the people, the food, you've got to be there for a while, and drawing does that. It really makes you concentrate on what you're looking at.
So is there anything left in terms of microscopes that you'd like to purchase or use, or is there any subject matter you'd like to look at that you haven't done so yet?
For me personally, there's always something. I mean, my big microscopes are very expensive. My cheap microscopes are very, very cheap. I've got microscopes that I've got off of eBay for 99 pence, and it's cost me more in petrol to go and collect them. If you're getting something locally, more in petrol to collect them than the microscope is, and they produce excellent images. And I've taken them to meetings, and people say, "How much is that?" 99 pence. And then I've got microscopes at the other end that cost more than my car.
So it doesn't have to be expensive at all.
Doesn't have to be expensive. It's my friend Steve, as he always says, it's not what it costs, it's the brain that's using it in terms of the results that you get. It's the same in all of the hobbies that I've been involved in. Photography, you get people that will buy a £6,000 lens, put it on a £5,000 camera, and still take lousy photographs. And then there are people who will just have their phone and take a lovely photograph. Same with telescopes. You've got people who go through this hierarchy. They'll get a small refractor, then they'll get an 8-inch telescope, a 10-inch telescope, then they'll get a dome in their garden, and they still sit indoors and record it all on a computer while they're in bed.
Yeah, very, very true, really.
Yeah.
Last few questions. When you're
Yeah.
preparing the slides, what process is involved?
Right. For most specimens, there's lots of ways that you can prepare a slide. You can do a permanent mount, and by permanent, we mean usually longer than you're going to live. Nothing is ever going to last 1,000 years. there are slides around from 200-300 years ago. Those are fairly common. So permanent mount, long term. Then a semi-permanent mount, something that you're going to use within your lifetime, maybe 5-10 years down the line, you might want to look at it again. Then there are temporary slides where you get some water, bung it on the slide and look at it. So there's that whole range. But there's also, if you're preparing a rock slide, you might have to cut very thin sections of rock and then grind them very carefully to get about a 35 micron thick section. I've got a section cutter over there for rocks. For tissues that you're going to look at, say, maybe from a plant or an animal tissue, you need to embed it in something first, which means taking the water out, you dehydrate it, and then you put it into wax. I've got some slides here, sort of a Blue Peter. Here's one that I prepared earlier. And you've got tiny bits of wax with a specimen on it. And those are unstained. What you end up doing with those is putting them in different stains so that you can see things. To cut those specimens, you use a tool called a microtome, and you can get tiny little ones, hand microtomes, or you can get very big, expensive sledge microtomes, and you can take a section of anything from a brain down to a flea. Anything you want to look at on a slide long term, you can do. You've also got a wide range of things you can mount it in. So my friend Gordon has been working on something called LOCA, which is liquid optically clear adhesive, which is really just what you've got on your mobile screen to hold the screen on. It's a liquid as it goes on. And if you've ever repaired a mobile screen, you know, you put the stuff on and then you shine UV light on it and it sets. We use LOCA a lot. It's not miscible with water, so you have to get the water out. So it's very good for things like insects, bee wings, legs, and things like that. But then there's also old traditional things like Canada balsam. Excuse me, it's a bit dusty in here. I just have to have a sip of this. And there are lots of different things that you can mount things in. Just have to get this frog out of my throat first. Let's hope you can edit it a little bit. Please tell me it's not live.
All adds to the flavour, Robert. Robert, it's been fascinating talking to you about microscopes and micrology. Yeah, I know we've only touched on a few elements of working a microscope, but it's just it's a huge field, isn't it? Really, there's so much you can. It is.
As I say, anything you want to look at, you can prepare a slide, and there's a microscope for everybody, depending on what you want to look at.
Yeah, and it doesn't have to be expensive, and you don't need a lot of gear. Just go to a pond, get some water, and start looking.
You just need one of these inspection cameras, and you can start with that. And don't be put off by cost, because on some of the meetings that we have, we loan out microscopes. Quite a few of the beekeeper groups will do it. We do it at the Iceni, and we do it at the Anglian group and at the Leeds group. If you haven't got a microscope, we'll loan you one. We'll even loan you one with a digital camera so that you can start taking photographs.
And is it, last question, just taking digital photography using the microscope, is that quite easy to do?
On here, I've got a little box at the top. Can you see that?
Yeah.
That's just plugged into this tube. You can get ones that plug into the eyepieces here, and then you just plug it into your USB port on your computer, and the software's there, and you're away. Just import the images. Most of them come, these are Brunel.
Yeah.
Get a little Brunel one out. And this one, I can pull it out. It's a tiny, I'm just putting that on the screen. That is a digital camera.
Wow.
It just plugs into where the eyepiece would go. It's got a USB lead. You can pick them up secondhand for a tenner.
Yeah.
They're ubiquitous because the technology has come on so much.
Yeah.
Something you would have bought last year for £50 is probably £10 secondhand, because by the nature of things like the photographers, things have doubled in what they'll do for half the price. and it is amazing what you can actually get now. Same with the microscopes. You can get reasonably priced research machines. I would advise people to ask the advice of someone that they know, or go to a club, because you don't want to end up with a piece of junk that needs.
We had a bit of technical interference then, Robert. But I get what you're saying. You know, if you need some advice before you want to buy, speak to someone. Yeah, I can hear you. Then we get a bit. I think the gremlins are at work here, Robert.
Sorry, I'm really sorry about this. There's nothing we can do about the internet.
It's fine. It's absolutely fine. I got what you were saying. You know, if you need, maybe get some advice before you make these purchases, just so you're buying the right thing and not some junk.
Yeah.
Look, Robert,
I don't think you've got to spend thousands of pounds on a microscope to get some good images.
No. Well, thank you very much. That's been brilliant. You've been really engaging, Robert. It's been fascinating, and it's been great talking to you.
Nice to talk to you too, Tony.
Yeah.
Have
anyway,
a good day.
take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.